concluding session and do some things with that. It might be shorter than normal, but so we're talking tonight about something all of us have: patience. Some of you smiling at me. Some of you starting to laugh at me. Okay, I got my white shirt on. Did y'all notice that? It's a different white shirt than I had on the other night. It has, the other white shirt hasn't been washed yet. And so I've got more than one. All right, so in general, just in life in general, why do you think we have a problem with being patient? Why are we so impatient? Or are we so impatient? And you say, well, I think people are so impatient. You can give us one of yours. Or you can just go ahead and confess and say, well, I'm impatient because. Why are people in general so impatient? That's right. But Wanda, you got to play along with me. And you got to give me your opinion. Why are people so impatient? Please, Wanda, don't say that because everybody else will clam up and okay, only the Lord knows, huh? Okay, I don't know. Don't have time, okay? Only the Lord knows. Time. Okay? Anybody else got an idea on this? Come on now, I don't have anything. I hadn't even thought about this. I just.
Frustration with others. You think somebody ought to know that, they don't.
All right. All right. Just keep shouting them out. I'll keep writing. Waiting. Did you say waiting? Yeah. We just don't like waiting. That's right. Luke, our 4-year-old grandson, I thought he was so impatient because, boy, when he wants something, the 5-month-old granddaughter, when it's feeding time, she's impatient. Boy, she doesn't like to wait. And I mean, she lets everybody know. All right. Let's translate that into what we're doing here. Sometimes we're impatient and wonder why we don't have a pastor sooner after we started. Why are we impatient about a pastor? And that's where we're really getting to, about calling pastor. Why do some people, now nobody in this room, first of all, you all haven't had a lot of experience at this, but there are some people that get really impatient if the search committee or it's taking a little longer. Have you ever heard that from others? Why do you think that is? Why is it that, and I'm a little more versed on this one, why is it that we get impatient in waiting on God's man to come to be the pastor? Okay. Don't understand the process. All right. Okay. Okay. Remind me, how many of you have ever been on a pastor search committee? Anybody? Okay, one. All right, good. All right, why else do we get impatient on waiting on the pastor? We don't understand the process.
We don't take it serious enough sometimes.
Okay, don't take it. We got a bunch of don'ts, don't we? Yeah, and okay, let me throw out one, because I've thought about this one. And we've plowed this field a little bit before. Fear. Because on an earlier session, we said, we're afraid attendance will fall off, afraid folks will leave the church, afraid that maybe we won't be effective. So fear. Some people are afraid of what might happen if we're without a pastor very long. If you become the interim pastor and they start giving COVID shots. It really helps bring back up attendance. I found that out. All right. Because I've had a lot of people say, I've got my 2 shots now. I'm back at church, preacher. And that's always good. All right. Anybody else think of anything else? Lack of faith. Okay. Lack of faith. That's a good one, Aaron. Lack of faith. Yeah. That it's all going to fall apart. It's kind of, or God doesn't have this, that and the great thing is, I used to have a church member in my first church out of seminary. I had 3 churches before my first full-time church, student pastorates. Every time I would change, schools, somebody call me as pastor. But my first full-time pastorate, a lady said to me, I think she was joking, "You can be replaced." And I said back to her, "So can you." And that's true. There's only one irreplaceable person in this church, and it's not me. And I don't want to burst your bubble, but it's not you. It's the Lord God. Okay. All right. So we're going to really try to do something about these right down here by trying to really work on the first one that Doug mentioned, and I didn't ask him to put that. We don't understand the process. Now, since we don't have a lot of experience, and that is really good, that a church doesn't have a lot of experience in the area of calling a pastor, it can be easy to get impatient. Now, Jason Lowe's going to give us a very brief introduction, and he had a longer one, but I did what you want to do on Sunday mornings to me. I cut him off.
If you're keeping up with the daily readings in the book, there's no doubt that you have already read multiple times that the average pastor search process takes between 12 and 18 months. Now, during your group session, you're going to discuss, most likely, how that makes you feel, that the pastor search process is going to take probably at least a year, if not longer. But I'm guessing, without even discussing it, that some of you are already tensing up at the thought that the pastor search could take a year or longer. Certainly can take a shorter amount of time for some churches, but I have seen it take a lot longer for other churches. And in our on-demand culture, it's hard for us to wait on anything. But the reality is, no matter how long it takes, you're going to have to make the commitment to be patient, to bear the spiritual fruit of patience while you wait for your next pastor. Now, if you've never served on a pastor search committee before, it's likely that you don't have really any idea about all the steps that need to be taken in a pastor search process. I certainly don't have time to discuss this in great detail. When I train pastor search committees, it takes about 2 hours to go through all of the steps.
All right, well, we're not going to take 2 hours because I'm going to move us on. But I got to tell you a story, okay? There was a little boy one time standing in one of these big department stores. Y'all remember what escalators are? Did y'all have an escalator here in Smithville? We didn't have an escalator in El Dorado where I grew up either. The tallest building we had was the grain elevator, and if you wanted to get to the top of it, you had to walk up the ladder. But anyhow, this big old department store had this escalator, and there's this little boy. I always like to name boys Iodine. Little Iodine was standing there just kind of looking. One of the sales clerks saw Iodine, and she came up to him and said, "Son, are you lost, or are you cut off from your mother? You look so sad." He said, "No, ma'am. I'm just waiting for my gum to come back up." That's the kind of patience that we need in this pastor search idea. Because you see, it may take some time. We may not understand. And we have that tendency to grow impatient. Now, here's what I want us to do. I want us to brainstorm. And I want us to kind of think about the good things and the bad things that happen whenever we're impatient, okay? What are the good things and the bad things that happen when we're impatient? Now, this is audience participation. Sunday morning, don't you interrupt me on anything while I'm preaching. But on Wednesday night, you can just give your opinion. This is an opinion thing, so there's no rights or wrongs, okay? What happens good when we're impatient? What happens bad? Who will be first? There's only one person that can be first. Okay, that's a good thing. Okay. When we're impatient, what are the good things or the bad things that happen? Okay. Just think about cooking and building and I'll put 2. Y'all can tell I didn't make a good grade in spelling. All right. Temper? Yeah. I'll tell you what, I'm in a building project right now. Let me get down here and confess. Someone else, good thing, just whatever. Tell me if it's a good thing or a bad thing. I take that's a bad thing. Okay. I was guessing. Okay. Good things or bad things that happen whenever we are impatient. Name one.
Bad thing would be making mistakes.
Mistakes. Okay. Good. Now we're rolling. Let's keep going.
Good thing would be seeing people baptized.
Oh. Okay. When we're impatient, I like that too out there, saved. I like that, saved, baptized. Thank you for mentioning that. All right, someone else. Good thing or bad thing that happens when we're impatient? Are you done? Whenever I'm in the middle of remodeling our bathroom, and when I get impatient, I have to do a do-over. Aaron, you ever have to do a do-over? Never, okay. Well, tighten your halo up in your carpentry skills and everything, all right? You got to do it over, right? When you get impatient. I do. Okay, what else happens whenever we're impatient? Just in general, or good or bad? Okay, can I tell on Teresa? I don't know what happened. We went to the seminary, and there was another couple that I found that I didn't mean to tell this. I hope she doesn't listen to this. And she made a pecan pie. I love pecan pies. And so we met this couple at church on Sunday night that were seminary students, and they were from Illinois. I was just thrilled that I was not the only person from Illinois in New Orleans. And so I invited them over. You could pour that pecan pie out of your glass. It was just runny. And so it doesn't turn out right. Does not turn right. And so if you tell her I told that, all right. More mistakes. Yeah, more mistakes. Okay. Now, let me ask you something. Of those 2 lists, and we haven't exhausted either one of them, which one's longer? Okay, bad things. And here's the thing about it. The same thing can happen in a pastor search if we are not patient. Now, a lot of people think that, the resumes are flooding in, and they may have. Whenever I announced that I was going to retire at Silver Springs in March, the 1st of March, 2018, to be effective August of 2018, I was really downhearted because we got a resume almost immediately that next week asking if it would be considered as pastor. One came in the mail. I said to my secretary, I said, listen, I don't know who's put the word out that this church needs a pastor, but you could at least wait till August whenever I retired and gone to start seeking resumes. Seeking resumes is not the first thing a church does in trying to find a pastor. So we're going to talk about the process tonight. And so we're going to try to talk about the process because the process, since the last time Ivanell was on a search committee, has really changed. Used to, if you wanted to be the pastor of Elizabeth Chapel Baptist Church, you'd get a friend to get another friend to talk to the brother-in-law of that friend to get your name before that church. The worst thing you could do was send them a resume. And that is changed. Guys send resumes directly, just like they did at Silver Springs. And neither one of those guys became the pastor, I'll tell you that right now. But anyhow, that wasn't the reason. But the reason is because churches are more open to the direct approach. In fact, churches will solicit. There are job boards, just like in your job. Some people get on Indeed. Is that a job board? Okay, I'm not real savvy about that, but I know the SBC Net they have where you can post your position, and so churches will solicit resumes, and then others will give recommendations. And also, even before COVID, it used to be CDs, and some DVDs, but now what has happened with the explosion of what? Churches doing what? Facebook. And so you can get to know guys. And so there's been a lot of changes. And so today, even the churches that are searching, they have the access to social media. And whenever I was at Hickman, they said that was really valuable in getting to know guys that had sent resumes to them, or however they got the resumes, and said it was appalling of some of the things that guys that were pastors or wanting to be pastors would put on their social media. Now, with all that being said, experts in this field, you know what expert is? Experts in pastoral searches. An expert is anybody that's 50 miles away from home. I live 39.4 miles from the church, so I'm not an expert. But they stress that, and they preach, and they encourage, and they drive home the fact that the total church membership needs to practice patience. The urging of James in James 5:7-8 is, meanwhile, friends, wait patiently for the master's arrival. You see, farmers do this all the time, waiting for their valuable crops to mature, patiently, letting the rain do its slow but sure work. Be patient like that. If you want to write that verse down, it's James 5:7-8, and the version I read it from is a paraphrase called The Message. So if you say, that's not what that said, let me read it to you again, since probably most of you can find The Message on the internet. Meanwhile, friends, wait patiently for the master's arrival. You see, the farmers do this all the time, waiting for their valuable crops to mature, patiently letting the rain do its slow but sure work. Be patient like that. Now, verse 9 in other translations talks about without complaint. What are the signs of becoming impatient? And that is, we start to complain. Now, on page 103, Jason Lowe kind of interprets complaining as saying, don't fight with one another, don't grumble about one another, don't participate in gossip or slander, and lastly, he says, don't get upset. And a lot of times during the pastor search, these things take place if the church is impatient. Since the vast majority of our church members have never been on a pastor search committee, it'll help us to understand the phases of the search. And I'm just going to walk you through them, and I'll be adding a lot of things and taking away some things that Jason Lowe does not deal with. But he does say on page 105, one reason why church members grow impatient during a pastor search is because they don't understand the process. Probably where you work, and maybe if you are one of the hiring people in your place of employment, you don't do it the way a church does it. And so we got to maybe forget about the way it works in our employment area. In fact, I think some churches have followed the corporate model a little bit too much in calling a pastor. And I prefer the word call over hire. I prefer the word ministry over job. You know, guys will tell me, I got a job at such and such church. I would rather say, man, I'm in the ministry at such and such church, but that's just one of my little quirks. The first phase, I keep saying phrase, the first phase is choosing a pastor search committee. How are we going to get this done? Now, if your church has, and I understand you do have somewhere, a constitution and bylaws, that's a good place to begin the work. Well, you say, what if it doesn't say much about it? Well, what did you do the last time you called a pastor? Well, it's been 35 years since we called a traditional pastor, and we really don't remember. Some of us have problems remembering what we had for breakfast. And so what did you do the last time? Did it work well? If you don't have anything in a constitution and bylaws, you can make it up as you go, but sometimes it's wise to see what has worked and what has not worked at other churches. So the first thing you got to do is choose a pastor search committee, and for those of us who have been around a long time, it's called the pulpit committee. The pastor search committee better describes what you're looking for. You're searching for the pastor that God has for you, and it's more than just preaching behind the pulpit. But I'll refer to it as a pulpit committee because sometimes. Then you enter another phase, and that is the training and the organizational phase. And it's really good to train. Denominational workers can help us do this. Maybe our director of missions here at the Salem Baptist Association. By the way, on the prayer guide, I put New Salem Baptist Association because for a year and 4 months I was in New Salem Baptist Association. And also on that prayer guide under missionaries, add the name of Patty Seals. Y'all know her? She informed me that she was a volunteer North American Mission Board missionary, and I'm glad she did. So you'll want to pray for her. So on your prayer guide under number 3, you may have already done that. So you can ask the director of missions to be of help in training. That's what Hickman did. Both churches that I'd served as interim had already formed their pastor search committee, and they loved and trusted Brother Marty Dodge, who, like our director of missions, a good director of missions. And so my first Sunday there, he was coming to talk to their committee. Or you can ask somebody from the Tennessee Baptist Mission Board to come. There's some really good guys that know the ins and outs of the work of a pastor search committee, and they'd be glad to have you come. Sometimes an interim pastor can help you train your committee. And if asked, I could do that. And some churches just hire an outside consulting firm. That's one of those experts. Now make sure he's 50 miles from home so that he can be an expert. And so, or you know what another definition of an expert is? A squirt under pressure. And so anyhow, you might need some training. There's some good books, there are manuals that they'll introduce you to, but I'd have somebody that has been around the block a few times in this thing come and help you to do that, especially because of the lack of experience that we have. And whenever I say you've got a lack of experience, you see that as a crown of jewels to wear and all. Then after you train, there's got to be organizing, getting some leadership within the committee. You'll need a chairman, all right? You may need other people, but you also need a recording secretary. That doesn't have to be a lady. We always think secretaries are ladies, but somebody to keep good, detailed minutes of the proceedings. Because as all this goes on, and we're talking about 12 months to a year, if we don't have a good written plan, we all have a different memory. When I was in college, yeah, I did go to college. We had I had a counseling course, and the professor came in out in the hallway. We were outside. We met in his office because it's just a small group, and he came in with a test, and he was going like this, and he didn't have a microphone on, and he was handing out our test questions, and he wanted to get out to the baseball field to watch the baseball team play, and so we were in there, and somebody said, "Here's 4 questions. What did he say we need to do?" Somebody says, "We need to answer 4 of 4. Somebody else says, "No, I heard him say answer 3 of 4. And somebody else said answer 1 of 4. And that didn't sound good to me because I had only one answer, one question that I knew anything about. And so we all agreed that it was, and somebody went to try to find him. They couldn't find him because we didn't know he went out to the baseball field. And so we sat down there and we decided it was answer 1 of 4. The next day we came in. He didn't speak to us. He walked into his office, opened the door. We filed in behind him. He said, "What are you all trying to pull?" He said, "I told you to answer 4 of 4. And so you got to have a recording secretary so that if there ever comes a time whenever we can't remember what we said or there is a dispute about what we said, we have somebody we say turn to and say, "What do your notes say?" You may have other people on the committee. How many do you have on a committee? I don't know. Don't get it too large, don't get it too small, but there's a right number. 5 is a good number, but you may deem that you have more. Now, another thing you got to do is determine your meeting times way ahead of time. Because if you don't, you know what's going to happen, don't you? We're going to try to call a meeting, and you will have some just called meetings. But we're going to call a meeting, and everybody say, "Oh, I got a ball game. My kid's got a ball game," or "I got to work," or "I've got this. I've already planned to do this family function. I can't come." So you want to have well in advance some meetings planned. So anyhow, that's what 2 things you need to do. The third thing that a committee needs to agree on is confidentiality. What happens in this room stays in this room. And sometimes church members and others in the community, especially other pastors, will maybe try to pump a committee member for information. Confidentiality, not because you're trying to hide anything, but it's like a cake. You don't take the cake out of the oven until the right time, or it will ruin the cake. Another thing is you're dealing with people's lives and your prospective pastors. And if we're not confidential and we don't try to be confidential, we could hurt their ministry where they are, and we wouldn't want to do that. Some churches have a commissioning service during the worship service. I helped commission the Salem Baptist Church pulpit committee before they'd ever called me as interim pastor. We were working out the details, and it was a little different than here. And so I wasn't even the interim pastor. They asked me, said, "Would you help us to commission our search committee?" And I did. After that, there could be a season of prayer and fasting by the committee and by the whole church. Fasting. You can tell I don't major on fasting very often. Notice that we haven't talked about receiving or soliciting the first resume. Jason Lowe says, you may not notice many of the actions that take place during the phase of training and organizing. How long will that take? Well, it just depends. But a good rule of thumb is 1 to 3 months. The third stage is the study and gathering materials stage. The pastor search committee, and there's a reason why I'm taking you through this. I'm not training you, but I'm in detail because there's a reason. You'll understand it if you'll stay with me till the end. The study the church phase. This is where we evaluate our organization, listing all the ministries of the church. We gather statistics about the church. And you say, well, Russ, that's a lot of work. The Baptist associations across Tennessee and probably across America have all that in a computerized program. You can get that. It's not as hard as you may think. You need to identify some trends as you look at statistical data. Okay, when were we up, when we were down, what was going on in the life of our church during this time, understanding some trends. You might need to identify some challenges and strengths of your church, and you've got so many strengths in this church. Furthermore, you develop or update a pastor's job description. What we're going to ask this guy to do. And now it won't be completed at this point, because if you're going to call somebody to be your pastor, he probably needs some input on that. But you need a general idea, because you're going to go talk to prospective pastors, and they say, well, what do you think a pastor should do? And if everybody's going, well, I think you ought to preach. I think you ought to visit. But you don't have an idea. It might hinder you in getting the man that God would have for this church. You got an excellent church history. And I would suggest that the church spends some time really getting familiar with that church history and maybe needing to update it. It goes through Brother Joel, I believe, but you might need to add some things, update it a little bit more in that area, whatever. And then you need to try to list the ways that your church operates. I don't know if you understand this or not, but Elizabeth Chapel doesn't operate the same way a lot of Southern Baptist churches operates. That's neither good nor bad. In fact, there's a lot of good to it and everything. But if you got a person coming in, and I can tell you this from experience, whenever Brother Boyd was trying to tell me some of the things on the phone, and we met with Brother Gerald and Daniel, I'm sitting there scratching my head and saying, I've never been a part of something exactly like this. So if that happens with me, an old geezer like me, and I've seen a lot of different things down through life, especially if you got a younger guy, if he hasn't been in a church just like yours, then he might have some trouble understanding how this all puts together. So if you can list some of these things so that you can be sure and cover them. And then after you study your church, a search committee needs to study the church's community. The demographics of the county. Is the county growing, dying? What's going on? And you say, well, Russ, where do we find out stuff like that? Again, the Tennessee Baptist Convention has equipped every Baptist association and director of missions to be able to do demographic studies here of your own county. You might need to know something about the various church population around here. How many Methodist churches there are, how many Church of God there are, how many Nazarene churches, and the various kind of churches, because those people are influential on the whole county, and also just gives the pastor an idea about things. Since you don't have a pastorium, it might be good to have some data on housing cost and availability, what's available. He may want to rent, he may want to have an apartment. You never know, he may want to buy a house. And so you need to have some of that. So you maybe enlist a real estate agent to help you with that. Maybe somebody that's a part of the church. We're getting real estate agents in the church. No, they're doing well up in Wilson County now. Recreational opportunities and festivals that you may have. I know you have the big music festival and some other things. And recreational, man, listen, if you have a pastor that is a hunter or a fisherman, he's in paradise down here. Okay, so, you just kind of want to, kind of accent those things. Schools, hospitals, medical practices, and things like that. You need to have a working knowledge of them, because they're going to ask about that, or they'll want to know about those kind of things, especially schools if they have children or going to have children. You need to have an idea of the miles to major cities. What are the major cities that you all travel to here? Nashville. That's a major city. Anything else? Okay. I was thinking more like Cookeville, Murfreesboro, Lebanon. And have an idea of what's there to offer, because let's say the pastor's wife has a medical condition, then definitely that can't be serviced here at St. Thomas DeKalb. They might need to know how far it is to a city like that. Then you got to determine what kind of pastor do you think will be effective in leading our church. Now, sometimes churches do surveys, or committees will do surveys. And then sometimes they just casually listen to the people and evaluate. Now, let me just give this word of caution, because somebody in this room is going to probably end up on the pastor search committee. There's a good chance of it. If you do a survey, one of the worst things I think that a church can do, and I've seen churches do this, is to publish those results to the general church population. Here's why. Let's say the committee finds somebody that they really believe to be God's man that doesn't meet that profile, and people say, did a lot of good for us to tell them what we thought we needed. They didn't pay a lick of attention to what we said. And it could be that you did, but God was leading in this way. And so, I think that's only, you gather that information and use it as a guide, but you might say, listen, we felt led to go in a different direction, maybe not hitting all the points or many of the points of what the survey said. Now, if you don't do it that way, I'm not going to be mad at you. If you publish it, then I'll love you and think you'll have to decide that and everything. So what is in a profile? Well, what age do you think that you need in a pastor? Now, if you want another pastor 30 years, you can't call a guy. You could call a guy, Don Owens. I mean, you don't call a guy in his 70s, okay, 60s or 70s. Now Don Owens 88, and he's still going like a Timex. He's remarkable. Educational level, that's important. What educational level do you want to have? Pastoral experience, how many years and what kind? What do you need in the marital status? Would you be all right with a single pastor as a church? Would your church be all right with that? Or does he have to be married? My first church, I didn't have a wife, and I wasn't going to get out and get married so I could be the pastor of that church if that was a requirement. Do you want him to already have children? His strengths and ministries. That would be influenced by your church and community study. What weaknesses are acceptable? Because remember, everybody's going to have strengths and weaknesses. What weaknesses are acceptable? And what life experiences do you have? I've got a friend who is a really good pastor, but he would never go to be a pastor of a rural church. Not because he thinks he's too good, but because he grew up in the city. He does not understand rural life. And he doesn't relate real good to rural life. And so he would not go to be pastor of a church in a rural area. And now some guys that have never been in a rural area can adapt. But what life experiences, what language do you want him to speak? And I'm not talking about Spanish or French or whatever. I'm talking about can he speak and talk to you all and find common ground? Today, it is vitally important that the pastor search committee study theology, because some disciplines or different theological thoughts use the same words but have vastly different meanings. And one of the things, back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, one of the things that was tearing up Baptist churches was the charismatic movement, because that was infiltrating the church. And people were scared that they might get a pastor that would purport charismatic movement. Another thing especially around Murfreesboro and Shelbyville, everything back in the 50s and the 60s was the independent Baptist church movements. Guys would come in and conceal that they were really independent Baptists, and then they would try to lead the church out of the Southern Baptist Convention. Today, it's a discussion between what two trains of thought? Calvinism and traditional Baptist thinking. Now, y'all know I'm a Calvinist. but we have the same language. We use the same language. I believe in election. But the meaning of election for me is different than it is for a 5-point Calvinist. I don't know what our church is, where y'all fall out, but I just figure you're just like me. And so no, I am not a 5-point Calvinist. There are some teachings that all of us accept in Calvinism. Personally, I think we just need to preach the gospel and do the work of ministry. But you got to understand and know how to evaluate. Let me give you an example. We were calling a minister of music, and this guy sent this really great letter. His resume, though it did not reflect any training or experience in leading church music, he was very convincing. And I led the church, the committee. I always had a committee, and I did all the calling, but I worked with a committee in music because I don't know anything about music. And the committee was really for him. I said, folks, he doesn't have any kind of working knowledge. He was in the band. That's the only thing is he's never worked with church music. I said, what else did you notice about him? They didn't know. And he was a Calvinist. And that wouldn't have worked real well at our church and everything. I hope I don't get fired Sunday. And then another thing that's just as important as theology is today's social issues. You know what I'm talking about? Political correctness and things like that. How does he feel about that? Then you got to give a thought to pastoral tenure, track record. If you're calling a pastor that it's not his first church, you got to give that consideration. There's a guy that lives in the area that 2 years and he moves every 2 years, and he's not a bivocational pastor. He was a full-time pastor, and about 2 years, about all he'd stay at any church. Now, if you're thinking, well, we want a pastor that is going to stay a little longer, we need to find someone else. Well, then you get to the search. That's about 1 to 3 months. I got to move on. The search phase. This is one of the longest parts of the search. You got to determine the scope of the search, whether it be national, statewide, what have you. The deadline for receiving resumes and recommendations. You got to figure out a system of reviewing and ranking those resumes and recommendations. And then you may do it all and everything, and you may find your guy you think, and then something falls apart and you're back to square one. But whenever you find the man that seems to be God's man for your church, you need to bring him to Smithville for at least one visit. You got to talk about salary. Now, I know none of us want to talk about salary with pastors. Lord, you keep them humble, we'll keep them poor. Kind of mentality or something like that. But you got to talk about those kind of things. You got to talk about, coming to in view of a call. And you got to work that out with notifying the church. You consult your constitution and bylaws. Be sure to do that if you have one. And during this phase, be sensitive that you might not be disruptive to the current church setting. I had a church come to our church, a small town church of about 1,000 residents, and they drove up in a church van with the church name on the side of it. Now, folks, we were not Pigeon Forge where there were all kinds of church vans in the parking lot. They all were dressed really nice, and they all sat on the same pew. And I came out from the back, and man, I could tell something was wrong. I didn't know they were coming. That's the only thing that saved my hide, I guess, and everything. I didn't know they were coming, and they were so obvious. It really upset the church, because it was a good church, and we got along real well. Now you found your man, so now it's the time to select or call. And so the call phase, I like that word call, and the support phase. Now there's a point of disagreement that I have with Jason Lowe here on page 118, paragraph 1. If you have your book, look or write that down, and you'll see that he says, once the search committee feels confident they have found the man of God that God is calling to be your next pastor, they will contact the remaining candidates to inform them. Now, I respectfully disagree, and the reason I bring it up, because your search committee may not ask me for any input. I'll tell them this whenever if they do. And it's okay if they don't. I don't have a problem. The reason why I disagree with him, if you let your candidates, all your candidates, know that they're no longer in the hunt, what happens if the guy comes and preaches in view of a call and the church rejects him as the pastor? Or let's say he comes and the church votes to call him, but he and his family says, you know, this is not the ministry for us. Then you have to go back to all those people that you said, hey, you're not the one, and you have to reestablish contact with them, or you got to start over and just solicit new recommendations and new resumes. And if you have to go back to them, how do you think that looks? So the time to do that is after you have him here to the church. The church votes to call him, and he accepts the call, and he's coming to be your pastor on such and such date. That's the time to contact the folks and say, thank you for your submission, but you came in, like in Monopoly, the second place in a beauty contest. And so anyhow, you do that. Now, you say, well, we got him coming. Is it all over? No, it isn't. For the search committee, you get him here, and we can go over that process. There's a big process to do that, to make it successful. You get him, you got to stay with him. He doesn't know very many people in this church except the search committee. You assist him in moving. That means you hire a moving company, you get a U-Haul and manpower, or you get a cattle truck and manpower and go get him, okay? And you get it all here. Make sure you clean out that cattle truck before you go get his furniture. Then there's other further orientation to the community, helping them to meet people. Then there's that ongoing support. Jason Lowe makes some really good suggestions on page 120 of how to support your pastor. And at this point, I would say to you, you can't have a cookie-cutter model for this. You can't model for someone else, because remember, every pastor and his family might be a little bit different. And so some people like a lot of folks around them. Some people want to be left alone a little bit more, so you just got to determine that. Now, I've rushed because here's what I want to ask you. We want to do a little more brainstorming. Now that you've just heard a sketch of what a pastor search committee does, this should spur the rest of the church to do what? What should this spur the rest of the church to do? If you say, man, that's a lot of stuff. That is a long process. What should this spur us to do? Start praying. Okay, that one's on my list. What else? Rely on God, yes. All right. Hey! Right, be patient. I wondered who would get that one. That's the obvious one from tonight's study. There are a few more that I can think of. Okay, I call that be appreciative. Be appreciative. Support the committee. All right. Here's another one. You'll get a laugh out of this. Be thankful you're not on the committee. No, you're thankful for their work. See, you got a better understanding of what they're going to go through. One more I can think of, and I'm going to just say it because of the lack of time. And my watch must be a little bit faster than y'all, so I'm going to take a couple of minutes here. Be kind. You say, Russ, we would never be unkind. Please hear me out. You can see that your pastor search committee is going to be spending a lot of time in evaluating, watching sermons, reading, going to meetings. What if, let's say it's a lady in the house and you know she's got a husband that couldn't cook, and going out to eat all the time would just bankrupt them. What if a caring church member or church members just one night took them a meal? What if it's a guy that his yard's going to get to look like, not because he's lazy, but because it's really a busy time at work, and then he's spending time on the committee, and he's going to have to get a hay baler to bale his yard? What if a couple guys just went over and mowed his yard? What about just a note of encouragement, appreciation, thankfulness, saying, well, don't you know, prayerfulness, we're praying for you, we appreciate what you're going through. What if the search committee, and a search committee I believe ought to make regular reports to the church, what if they come up and say, you know, we thought we had our man, but it didn't turn out that way. We were kind of devastated. A church in the Middle Tennessee area was ready to issue a call, and it all fell apart. I mean, it fell apart big time. What if somebody wrote them a note with a Bible verse like in Galatians 6 that says, do not lose heart in doing good, for in due season you will reap if you faint not. Now, here's why I took you through just kind of all this laborious stuff, and you're sitting there thinking, I don't care about this. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. I want us to be praying. I want us to be relying on God. I want us to be patient. I want us to be appreciative and supportive. I want us to be thankful, and I want us to be kind. All right, anything, I've tried to prod you all into participating tonight, and you do a good job. I'm just cutting up with you. Anything you want to bring up, you thought of, you said, man, this is so good, I got to say this about tonight's study. You know, like, hey, here's an idea.
What if the pulpit committee?
Mm-hmm.
How do you, I mean, do you pray for people to be on the, or how do, I mean, is that, are we praying right now for people to volunteer, to God call you, to say, God's calling me to be on the pulpit, you know, how does that work?
How does that work? How do you get people on the pulpit committee? Well, you ask them to meet in a room and you lock the door. Now, again, that's where you go if you have church constitution and bylaws. Sometimes it spells out how you get a search committee. If you don't have a constitution and bylaws or it doesn't spell it out, what have we done in the past? If that's worked well, that's good. Sometimes I can tell you how we did it at Silver Springs. Of course, and they were 30 years from pulpit committee. But when we were calling staff people, again, we did a little different. I led every staff member search. And sometimes, and I'd call in people to help. And I'd ask our nominating committee to nominate those folks, giving us a broad group. We didn't want all the same, we didn't want to look all the same. We wanted men and women. We would have a teenager on, or someone that was a very young adult on the committee, especially when we was looking for a youth person. We would have folks that maybe were deacons and one, at least a deacon. We had a personnel committee, so we had a personnel committee member so that they could be the liaison between the personnel committee and the search committee. So somebody in this church, and maybe the deacons of this church will get together and figure that out. Whenever the leadership of your church will say, okay, it's time for us to form a committee. Now, and again, somebody asked me one time, are you pushing us to get a pastor? Indeed not. I'm fine with being here. But I don't want us to wait to the last minute. Plus, I just read this book, and I thought it would be good. I thought, I got to do something on Wednesday night. No. But I thought, hey, especially for this church, because of our lack of experience of calling pastor, now, again, that's a badge of honor. And I just thought it'd be good for us to kind of walk through this so that whenever somebody approaches one of you and says, hey, we've been praying about it, and we want to know if you would serve on the search committee. If we have a search committee, however it's done, I don't care. And you will say, well, what does it mean to be on a search committee? How's this work? Well, now you have a little background, and that can help out the person that comes and asks you to be there. You do pray about it. We do need to be praying right now for our search, who's on that search committee. And again, it should be people that are in the mainstream of the church. Some of the biggest disasters I've seen was whenever somebody says, well, let's put so-and-so on there, and he not very committed to the church, but maybe that'll help him to be committed, or because he has certain connections or something like that. You need the backbone, because here's what's going to happen. Your prospective candidate's going to ask a lot of questions. Not only are you interviewing him, he's interviewing you. And if people, like I asked a search committee member one time, I said something about, well, what kind of work do you do in the church? What kind of ministries do you have? He said, I don't have any. He said, I'll just be real honest with you, preacher. I don't know how I got on this committee. They asked me, but he said, and then this guy was a nominal church member. I can tell you I wasn't impressed that they put a nominal church member on that committee. Now, again, the rest of them were pretty good people, but this guy, I found out he attended less than, about once a month, one service. And not because he was out of town or sick or anything. He was a fisherman. He was always gone. He had never done any ministry in the church. Had never taken a position. They just put him on the committee in hopes that he would say, well, if we got a pastor that he liked, then maybe he'll get more faithful. His family was faithful. I'd put his wife on there, but he wasn't. And so anyhow, so that's how you do. You pray. Trust your leadership. You got good leadership in this church. I don't think this church could operate the way it does if you didn't have good leadership. And I'm not even sure who the leadership is. But what I'm saying is, it obviously is working, and it's good. And everything. I've said that facetiously. I know some. But it's been a strange startup because of the COVID thing. But you all make it. You all make it. Trust your leadership. And I'm here to help. I don't dictate. I won't tell you who to call as pastor. I won't sit in on the meetings as they're discussing anyone. But if you want me to help you, I'll be glad to help you. And I'm not bucking for a job either, as far as to meet with your search committee. But if you think I could be of help in training or helping you get organized, get started, or running some interference, or helping you through some difficult times, I'd be just thrilled to. And there are other people as well. I tell you, someone that knows a lot about pastor search committees. His daughter comes to church here, and that's Galen Brown's daddy, Ray Gilder, who's the pastor at First Baptist Church of Gordonsville. He'd be an invaluable resource. And as well as folks, our own director of missions, I believe, would be a valuable resource, as well as guys like down at the Tennessee Baptist Convention, Tennessee Baptist Mission Board. You got all kinds of resources. And so anyhow, all right, well, I'm not finished, but our time is gone. And it's dark outside. So, and we're on time because my watch was a little faster and everything. Any other word? Thank you. That's a good question, Vicki, and everything. All right. Well, you ready to pray and go home? All right. Brother Aaron, would you lead us in